Hi, this is Tom Bodett. 20 years ago, my curious nature brought me to new frontiers. Well, now I'm heading out to track the journeys of earlier Americans who followed their own curious natures on America's historic trails. This time we're in Seattle, picking up a trail from the late 1800s when tens of thousands of half-crazed and mostly wannabe gold miners boarded ships to find their fortunes up in Alaska and the Yukon. The Gold Rush Trail takes us back to 1897 when men from every part of the country were rushing through Seattle to chase the elusive dream of gold in the Yukon. The trail took them through the Puget Sound to Alaska and across the mountains to the Klondike River in the Yukon. Today we're looking at the Seattle end of the trail. We'll wander the same streets as the prospectors of a century ago. We'll see how the little town of Port Townsend figured into the trail, and we'll discover what might have inspired some of the adventurers to call their expeditions up short and stay put right here. Their stories are unbelievable. All those hopeful characters piling on the rickety boats to sail off to their dreams or their doom is as awe-inspiring as the country they had to cross to get there. And the truest story is most of them got there too late to find any gold. Well, all those blessed gold chasers began their Yukon quest here in Seattle. But the locals will tell you that that pot of gold wasn't at the Yukon end of the proverbial rainbow. It was right here. The determined dreamers rolled into the city. They filled up the hotels, bought supplies and steamship passages, and turned the business district of Seattle into the real gold mine. Pioneer Square here is where people were cutting their deals. This was the city center. Still looks an awful lot like it did when our hopeful herd of Yukon gold hunters stampeded through. So Pioneer Square is where we're starting our trip along the time-worn Gold Rush Trail. The Pioneer Square Historic District is just south of Seattle's modern downtown. Coffee bars, restaurants, and boutiques fill up turn-of-the-century buildings, and visitors can enjoy Seattle's two main beverage obsessions. Micro-beers are the latest.
We have a bitter and we have an amber. The bitter, we use traditional English hops, whereas the amber, we use Northwest Pacific hops from the Cascades. All of our beers, we brew them on the premises in the brewery out the back there.
Brew pubs in the district cater to connoisseurs looking for the latest new brew. And out-of-towners can't help but notice the local compulsion for espresso. Tall, skinny decafs, half-calf Americanos, raspberry mochas. Well, these aren't your ordinary cups of coffee, and it seems like you're never more than 50 feet from a latte in this town. Well, that doesn't hurt my feelings any. One of Seattle's biggest success stories is how a little coffee company from the West went on to become the nation's biggest player. And that's not unrelated to our story of the Yukon Trail, because it turns out this street, where Starbucks now sits, is the site of Seattle's first great retail success. These buildings on First Avenue were literally overflowing with supplies for the stampeders. At times, goods were stacked 5 feet high on the sidewalks. The merchants were supplying each of these rookie gold miners with a year's worth of supplies to take north with them, and that was about a ton for every person. Just off First Avenue, there's the Klondike Gold Rush National Historical Park. Well, that's a long handle for a little museum, but a good place to check out the basic stories.
Gold was discovered back in 1896 in the Yukon Territory of Canada. It was a Canadian gold rush. 100,000 people set out, and yes, about 80% were Americans. Of the 40,000 that did make it, 300 people did get wealthy. Only 50 people retained their wealth throughout their life. Really what started the frenzy, the gold rush frenzy, was two ships. The first ship was called the Excelsior, which pulled into San Francisco back in 1897. But 2 days later, another ship pulled here in Seattle down on Pier 57. It was called the SS Portland. On board with 68 men, a little bit better than 4,000 pounds worth of gold.
Seattle spread the word and the gold rush was on. Today, rangers pan for phony gold and explain how the Yukon gave up $10 million worth of gold the first year of the strike.
Think of that.
That was a princely sum, but it pales when compared to the $25 million that Seattle merchants took in.
Of the 2,000 pounds that was required.
Locals promoted their city like there was no tomorrow, and the publicity established Seattle as the premier staging area and outfitter for the Klondike Stampeders.
Everybody, they meant everybody. Again, you had your food, your clothing, and your tools. Back here, there's a big...
Those hopeful souls played out a scenario that's been at the heart of every move to stretch the borders of the American frontier since the Pilgrims fell off Plymouth Rock. Optimism and gullibility worked together to convince each one of them that the gold would be theirs with a little hard labor and a lot of luck. All through 1897, this totem pole in Pioneer Square looked down on those anxious adventurers, its watchful and amused eyes overseeing the assembling of supplies and expeditions. The square was called Yesler's Corner then. Several decades earlier, it had been the site of Henry Yesler's house and sawmill. That was back when a handful of pioneers were clearing the forests around their frontier village to make room for a city, should somebody find need of one. So Seattle was only 45 years old when those prospectors descended on her with their shopping list. But she wasn't a scraped-together frontier town anymore. That old town had burned down in the Great Seattle Fire just 8 years before the Yukon Gold Rush. People heading north stopped over at a brand-new, bona fide, first-class American city. Today, you can pick up Pioneer Square history by starting at Doc Maynard's Saloon for the Underground Tour.
We're going to go underground. We're actually going to enter this building at what was once a second-story window. And we'll head underground. I caution those of you that are wearing sandals, if you have exposed toes, you should walk towards the middle of the group. We do refer to the toes as rat hors d'oeuvre trays.
The irreverent tour explains how Seattle was rebuilt following the fire of 1889.
So instead of regrading and rebuilding, which should make sense, they rebuilt first, and they ended up regrading afterwards, which is really different. And what I mean by that is they built the buildings at this old city ground level where we are right now, going up, and gradually they changed the street level, and streets went up anywhere from 8 to 32 feet in height.
By the time of the gold rush, windows that used to face the sidewalk were underground, and Pioneer Square looked much as it does today. Seattle was primed to promote itself and its shipping ties to Alaska, and the arrival of the gold ship Portland presented an ideal opportunity for publicity.
Well, to get a handle on the city's publicity stunt, we're going to backtrack to the day the ship of gold was first spotted off the coast of Washington. We're headed across the Puget Sound for the Olympic Peninsula.
The Olympic National Park takes up a lot of the interior of the peninsula, but we're going to the little waterfront community of Port Townsend. It's about 2 hours from Seattle, a lot of it by ferry. Well, since it was so hard to cut a road through the forest here, in the old days, people mostly got around on what was known as the mosquito fleet. It seems the menagerie of boats out on the Sound was so thick that the locals thought they looked like a swarm of mosquitoes. In 1897, the mosquito fleet had everything in it from coal steamers to leaky canoes. But the craft that cut the widest swath was the gold ship from Alaska. Locals were looking for her because her sister ship had docked 2 days earlier in San Francisco. It must have been from along this part of the Olympic Peninsula that she was first sighted as she passed into Puget Sound. Well, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer saw the opportunity for a big story. So they got the wild idea to charter a tug and intercept the ship. Their reporter boarded the Portland mid-channel at 1 o'clock in the morning. He got the miners' stories, ogled their gold, then jumped back on the tug and telegraphed the story from this building in Port Townsend.
This is it. This is the building where he came to file the telegram.
Yeah.
This is the staircase he would have run up to file his story. Then he tore back down these stairs because he wanted to get back aboard the tug to get to Seattle.
And the gold ship.
You bet.
You can pick up the fine details of the gold rush days by arranging a walking tour through the visitor center.
And we were here to get your money. If you came to town, you were a sailor, we'd have some form of entertainment that you'd enjoy.
You're trying to get a little bit of that gold before it got to Seattle.
You bet. And if you were a nice religious guy, we had plenty of churches up on the hill.
50 bars and how many churches?
About a dozen. Not quite as many.
Port Townsend is one of those places that seems anchored in time. Its original downtown is still standing. Today, while no competition for the big city across the water, nostalgia, art, and music draw their share of visitors and support a thriving little community. Houses of a century gone by recall a time when the town was competing with Seattle for dominance of the Puget Sound. Port Townsend lost the battle, and lucky for us, she simply never had the money to replace her aging architecture with anything newer. Today's tourist dollars help to restore the town to the Victorian elegance of the gold rush days. Let's go back to Seattle to find out what happened after the gold rush news arrived from Port Townsend. The newspaper story proclaimed that a ship was about to dock in Seattle with a ton of gold aboard. Well, when she docked right over here at what was then called Schwabacker's Wharf, there were a ton of people waiting to meet her. Well, there's tons of people here still, but for different reasons. Just at the edge of Pioneer Square, this is now known as Pier 57 and part of Seattle's waterfront park. Pier 57 exhibits take you back to that July morning in 1897 when hordes of people were here to see a boatload of rich men for themselves. The story had infected the community with gold fever, and the city fathers saw to it that it turned into an epidemic. 30,000 copies of a special Klondike edition suddenly appeared in the nation's post offices, libraries, and railway stations. And Seattle cashed in. One of the businesses on the waterfront to share in the wealth was the Old Curiosity Shop. This place is still owned by descendants of Joe Stanley, who opened it in 1899. You see, Joe specialized in attracting the stampeders with a collection of ethnographic exhibits and then relieving them of some of their money with the kitsch. And it works the same way now as it did 100 years ago. Because, like the man said, there's a sucker born every minute. Well, the city was fun and a little wild at first, with entertainers like exotic dancer Little Egypt, who shocked the better classes by wearing a costume that ended above her knees and left her arms bare and her neck uncovered halfway to her waist. Well, Little Egypt is gone, but the waterfront still draws visitors looking for fun. For a lot of them, that includes the half-hour boat trip to Blake Island State Park and Tillicum Village. It's an interpretive center of Northwest coastal native peoples.
Hi, welcome to Tillicum Village.
steamed clams and alder smoked salmon, traditional staples in a Northwest Indian diet, fill up guests in the Longhouse before a time-honored rendition of the Dance of the Wind. But I doubt many of our Klondike prospectors took the time to appreciate the native culture. Back in the big city, they were just too busy, charging through town on Seattle's modern streetcars and hoping to make a buck. Well, the Alaska Gold Rush is gone, along with most of the streetcars. Only one run survives, from Pioneer Square along the waterfront to another Seattle landmark, the Pike Place Market. It's Seattle's farmers market and year-round street fair. And this place has a great attitude.
Here you go, folks. First of the Washington-grown tree-ripe peaches. Here's Regina variety from the exotic Wapato, Washington area. Who wants to try a peach?
I'll buy a whole one.
You got it.
Built at the end of the gold rush boom, it's here today because of some recent grassroots struggles to control gentrification. But the market was used to battle. That's how it was born. Back in 1907, the city population exploded. Local farmers decided they were tired of seeing profits going to middlemen and wanted to sell their produce direct to the people. Well, the middlemen tried to stop them, even turning to sabotage. But the farmers drove their wagons in, lined them up along here, and waited for the customers. 3 months later, the city built them this market, and farmers and artisans have been selling direct to the public ever since.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
The farmers were typical of the tenacious breed that settled here. Seattle had a reputation as a place where little guys could make it. And by the turn of the century, locals with imagination and energy were manufacturing everything from tents and soda water to eyeglasses and ships. About a 10-minute drive north of downtown is Fisherman's Terminal, where we pick up the story of how people pitched in to get the stampeders north to Alaska. Well, in the first rush to reach the Yukon, demand for ships so outweighed the supply that anything that'd float was put into service. Prospectors reported some pretty dicey voyages.
Well, probably the looniest story to come out of this was that of the old sidewheeler, the Eliza Anderson. So this was a riverboat, and it wasn't equipped to carry enough fuel for a trip like this. So the owners hired a tug to pull a barge of coal behind her. Well, of course, the first storm came up, separated the ship from its coal, and the captain ended up having to throw everything that had burned into the engine. Well, with the last door and galley bench in the boiler and the doomed ship heading for the rocks, this lone passenger staggers into what's left of the wheelhouse and steers the ship into a hidden cove. Then he quietly disappeared back into the crowd of passengers. Who was that mess man?
Well, that rather dubious flotilla has now turned into more sedate pleasure crafts and commercial fishing boats. Much of the Alaska fishing fleet winters at Fisherman's Terminal, the largest fishing harbor in the country. Commercial captains, as well as Sunday skippers, put away fresh seafood and tell their fish stories around the boats at dock. And the variety of food in the terminal restaurant is probably more than you'll see on most fishing boats. Well, after the initial rush to send anything that'd float to Alaska, local builders went to work, turning out scores of new boats to meet the big demand.
A lot of people made a lot of money as the Seattle business community figured out new ways to profit from Alaska. The city's the way in and out of there. See, Alaskans will tell you still that if you want to go any place in the lower 48, you've pretty much got to come through here first. Of course, in the old days, people traveled almost entirely by water.
Today, people go mostly by air. And most people associate air travel with one of Seattle's biggest successes. Maybe you've heard of them. This is their original airplane factory. It started out as one of those gold rush boat building yards. William Boeing was having a boat built here when the company went bankrupt. So he bought the operation and finished the boat himself. Well, after taking some flying lessons, he decided boats weren't all the thrill they used to be, and he turned to airplanes. That was in 1916. Today, the old building is part of the Museum of Flight, about 15 minutes south of downtown at Boeing Field. And most of the history here is over my head. From biplanes to spy planes, aviation is covered under one roof. Building planes is serious business, but Seattle has never been a strictly business kind of place. Maybe that's because Seattle conducts its business in the middle of some outrageous country. Real wilderness is just a short drive away. Locals have a saying, the mountain is out, and they don't need to say which one. It's Rainier. Hiding a lot of the time above the northwest legendary clouds. When the mountain's out, it's really out. Well, Mount Rainier National Park is less than 3 hours from downtown. On the way is one of the remnants of earlier travel in the foothills. The Mount Rainier Scenic Railroad at Elby is a short round trip through some incredibly pretty country. Beyond the train is the national park, and at the end of the road is paradise. And everybody seems to think so. Up here, the clouds can change fast, but even on days when the sometimes shy mountain won't reveal her top, visitors crowd the trails to get close to the glacier and count that as a pretty fair day. The native tribes said the mountain was Tahoma, a place of spirits to be respected from afar, and I'm sure they had good reason to think so. But the newly arrived white guys, acting just like white guys do, were bent on climbing its 14,000-foot summit. So, by the year of the gold rush, people were climbing up and down the mountain like nobody's business. Seattle cashed in on another gold rush just 2 years after the Klondike strike, this time in Nome, Alaska in 1899. So the boom continued and Seattle continued to promote itself. In 1909, she capped off the gold rush decade with the grand Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition on the University of Washington campus. Frosh Pond first gushed its water among elaborate exposition buildings filled with products and displays from around the Pacific. You see, by now, Seattle had its trading eye on more than Alaska. Local author Paul Dorpat is full of stories about the exposition.
And basically, they were all temporary structures. They were ticky-tacky. They were made of plaster of Paris, substantial enough where you could walk into them and on various balconies, but they all came down after the fair, with a few exceptions. The mountain, of course, was a very important part of the AYP. In fact, the officials were very much into explaining that Mount Rainier was the only real mountain that any fair had ever had. So that you could look from the edification of the beautiful Beaux Arts classic structures, you could sweep right around like this, and there would be the mountain. And they liked this reality. Magnificent.
Still is.
Still is, yes.
The Alaska-Yukon Pacific Exposition is history, but it left its imprint with a basic campus plan for one of the nation's largest and most beautiful universities. We've got one more stop on the Seattle end of the Gold Rush Trail. The Virginia 5 calls to mind how so many of our hopeful miners found their way to Alaska, crowded aboard the decks of ships like this. Well, she's just the kind of passage the prospectors of a century ago would have booked for themselves. Same old engine, same lines to the rugged hull slicing through the chilly northwest waters. The Virginia 5 has taken it easy in her old age, circling around and reminding us of those remarkable passengers who carried a wish and a prayer and little more than the wind in their hair. Most people following the Gold Rush Trail today will fly to Alaska to pick up the other end of the trail, but the waters are still plied by pleasure crafts and fishing boats, as well as ferries and luxury liners, which leave from north of Seattle. So if you've got the money and the time, you can still make it to Alaska along the Inside Passage. Next time, we'll see what's further up the Gold Rush Trail in Alaska as we cruise icy waters and stop at mining towns that grew up along the way. Well, that's all for this time. This is Tom Bodett, hoping you'll join us again on America's Historic Trails.